morning, good morning, good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are we doing? Good morning, Rebecca. How are you doing?
Great. How are you doing, Cheryl?
I'm good, thank you. In sunny Basingstoke, it looks incredibly sunny.
I am. It's beautiful today.
Good. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a really popular one, actually, and a few people have said, "I didn't know that diversity or the lack of diversity potentially, in this whole area, procurement supply chain was an area for concern." So I think that's why it's quite an interesting one. But before we go on, so thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're mid morning, flying between here, there, and everywhere. So obviously, your background is stellar. So we were sat on the panel recently for this amazing procurement conference, and I know that as I described, you are somewhat of a powerhouse when it comes to global procurement. I don't know whether there's anybody that you haven't worked for or with, either as a consultant or heading up supply chain management. So you've worked with some of the world's best known B2C and B2B brands, which I guess that's quite interesting in terms of doing both. But you really do champion learning and development in this space and innovation around supply management. And particularly, as I've seen recently on some of your LinkedIn posts, you are an evangelist for supply chain sustainability. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me today, Cheryl.
And of all of the things that you've done, because you've done so many things and worked with so many brands, and as I say, you've done the B2C and B2B, what's kind of been your favourite? What are you sort of most passionate about, or what challenges you the most? What do you enjoy?
I think for me, it's any opportunity to get transformation with a team of people. So my time at Coventry Building Society has been outstanding because it's a wonderful opportunity to address the organization's purpose, which is giving people the power to be better off through life, through the relationships that we have with our colleagues and our suppliers. And our suppliers do a huge amount to support people in our local community through volunteering, through donating, through finding ways in which they can give skills and time to the betterment of local people in Coventry, and that's been a huge privilege. So yeah, my role right now is absolutely one of the most rewarding things I've done, despite being, as you say, not in many of the multinationals that I would have worked for sort of globally, but actually having that that focus in the UK really sort of concentrates on what what's really important in terms of how procurement people can have an impact on society.
Yeah, there's definitely something, isn't there, about when you are, in an organization and you feel really aligned, you feel as though you're in an organization that really is there for almost like a bigger purpose than, than just the profits and the pound signs. It's quite rewarding. So one of the facts that I shared on LinkedIn this morning, there was a really interesting article in SIPS, the SIPS magazine a couple of months ago, and it said something like only 13% of chief supply chain officers, CSCOs, which was a new acronym for me, in Europe's 500 biggest companies are women. And the report found that France had the highest levels of gender diversity, with 17% of CSCOs being women, in comparison to 13% in the UK and 11% in Germany. But basically, the headline of the article was that almost like procurement, certainly at a leadership level, is one of the least diverse next to the CEO, which is really interesting. And actually, a couple of people commented on my LinkedIn post this morning, and they were quite surprised. But I guess you've worked in that industry for some time, so have you got any thoughts about why that is? Maybe what is it that about the procurement, the discipline, and the function of procurement that means it perhaps isn't as diverse as some of the other functions?
Yeah, and Cheryl, as you say, the numbers there are stark and speak for themselves about procurement leaders and how we absolutely do need to attract more talent across all diversity identity segments. I think some of it is to do perhaps with the nature of the reporting line through procurement. It's often perhaps part of the operational part of the business. In a manufacturing organization, that could be in a sort of factory environment or an operational environment. For my organization, it reports through finance, and perhaps that does make a perception for some people entering their careers that procurement is solely to do with money. It's something where you have to be great at maths. It's linked to economics, and whilst having a great sense of commercials is of course essential for procurement, it's a people area of people function like many others. You've got to be thinking about how people are motivated, what drives them, how you can influence and persuade effectively, which is appropriate for anyone who's who feels as if they've got an affinity in that space. I do think things like working patterns that are relevant to any profession really make a huge difference. So certainly for procurement, it's if you're working on a really, really large project, it's something you do have to lean in quite heavily. That might involve some periods of intense working, which could be challenging for people who perhaps are carers or part-time workers, or maybe have a slightly more flexible working arrangement, which has traditionally been typically women. But I think in the kind of post-COVID environment, it could be anyone in that situation really who has a sort of mix of responsibilities. So I think historically that probably accounts for some of the reasons, but it feels for me now as if we've got a bright new future, in that there's a wonderful amount of very, very talented women in procurement leadership roles and coming into those roles who will be just amazing role models for the future and the function.
Fantastic. Maxine's commented to say that she agrees. I think that's to do with maybe the bit around, I don't know if it's to do with the bit around it, procurement being connected to sort of like the mathsy side and almost like the scientific side, but also potentially the intensity sometimes, particularly if you're on a large deal, which really reminded me of something I talked about a few lives ago, was this concept of greedy work. I don't know if you've come across it, but work that really demands a lot. It demands you jump, you jump at weekends, at late nights, all of those sorts of things, as you say, tend to sort of disadvantage individuals with caring responsibilities. So that's really interesting. And then I guess there's something about procurement, and I know that the breadth of what you do, because procurement's quite broad, isn't it? In terms of the whole sort of sourcing and then procuring and then paying and all of the way through. It has lots of different priorities to juggle. There's things like value, cost saving, sustainability. So where does diversity fit into all of that? Do you feel that diversity is maybe given the priority that it needs, given that there are so many other priorities to juggle?
It's so tough, and Jerry, you're quite right. It could sit in so many different camps. In some organizations, they would see it as a sustainability element, because if we're talking ESG, the environmental, social, and governance elements, diversity, inclusion, equity are sort of social, issues that are to do with well-being, with appropriately supporting colleagues and ensuring that everyone in the organization and its supply chain are treated with dignity and respect. I think in other areas, it's much more related to kind of colleague experience and ensuring that all external stakeholders, be they investors, customers, suppliers, kind of have that extension of that experience, and the way in which we treat our colleagues, particularly if we have this sense now of a greater sense of belonging in the workplace. We want to extend that to those external partners. So I agree, it could sit in so many different areas. I think for us in Coventry Building Society, there's close alignment with those, but also again with our place-based strategy, where the city of Coventry is super important to us. And so in our description of what we would call a diverse supplier, we would include in that our local suppliers, of which we have many. We would include the many small businesses we work in, who are so crucial, not just to our organization because they're very agile and very lean, but just to the UK economy, the majority of businesses. And also any supplier that is owned and managed by underrepresented groups. So for us, diversity is a really, really broad church. And, aside from, sort of what category I suppose it fits under, as an organization, we fundamentally believe, when we're reaching out to prospective organizations we want to partner with, getting an alignment on values is super important, and also having a really strong sense of fairness and access to opportunity. And that's something that diverse suppliers can really struggle with, whether you're a small business that just doesn't have a sales and marketing infrastructure, whether you're owned and managed by an underrepresented group, and perhaps you just don't have perhaps the background, the experience, you haven't been able to access education or a qualification in this space. Even organizations like social enterprises that, again, we would fit in that description, where so much kind of time, energy, percentage of profits are focused on social good, that actually selling is not always kind of core to what that organization does. And so for us, because we focus very, very much on fairness and access for all people, whether it's colleagues, talent, and as I say, our stakeholders as well as our customers, diversity is really part of that. That it's not acceptable just to keep reapproaching the tried and tested big.
Oh, okay. We have lost. I've lost Rebecca. Just give me a moment. I lost Rebecca mid-flow, so I'm hoping that I am still live, which I think I am. Hopefully Rebecca will be able to rejoin, but obviously Rebecca was talking there about the link between internal diversity and then also diversity with suppliers, etc. One of the things I thought that was really interesting, actually, that I'll just talk about while Rebecca jumps back on, was the diversity in procurement, linking to just, I guess, the nature of procurement as a discipline. So procurement being, an intersection of science, and science in terms of maths. And I sort of potentially see procurement as the intersection between science in terms of the maths element, but also then law. And law, we know historically and traditionally has quite a few challenges in terms of diversity. And also the other area that I thought, procurement is sometimes what I would regard to as almost like the flip side of sales. And I wondered whether some of that was sort of part of the issue as to why it's been a challenge in terms of getting more diversity in procurement. I'm hoping that Rebecca will be able to join us, because obviously, as you can see, although I'm an expert in diversity, I'm not an expert in procurement. Okay, Rebecca, I think is jumping
Hi.
back in live. Here we go. Hi, Rebecca, how are you doing?
Hey, great, thank you.
I don't know what happened there. I managed to lose you literally as you were mid-flow. So I tried my best to fill in, possibly failed.
Awesome, thank you.
But I was just getting into it. It's really interesting. You were talking about the supplier diversity and working with vendors, etc. What does that look like in terms of what are the sorts of things that you look for? Is it the owner management piece, or is it, for example, larger suppliers, diversity within those organizations, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, a combination of both is essential. And I think for us, because we do want to kind of encourage engagement with those firms owned and managed by marginalized communities, we definitely did want to spend more focus kind of reaching out to them, which is why we partner with Collider, which is essentially a way of connecting corporate buyers with some of those diverse firms. We publish our tenders on the Collider platform to give them visibility, and that's hugely helpful. But similarly, there's a lot of learning that we've gained from our larger, more established suppliers, both in terms of sort of, ways in which we can extend what they've done in their business to our own learning, as an organization ourselves, how we're approaching diversity and inclusion. And as an example of that, we, as an organization, over the last year, we've established quite a lot of employee networks that kind of represent different sort of belonging groups, whether that's related to carers or menopausal women, or all different sorts of sort of interests. And it's been super interesting to see from some of our suppliers how that's where those organizations that are quite mature in this area have evolved some of those networks. And for me, as part of the Black Network for colleagues of African and Caribbean heritage, we've had lots of chances to reach out to our suppliers who have had similar networks works, learn from them, understand the pitfalls in the journey so that we can, you know, sort of accelerate what we're doing, which has been incredible. So I think both are super important. And one of the key enablers, I think, for us in thinking about sort of marginalized communities within our supply base was actually being able to set a baseline for that, because I think for so many of us, we think we know they're out there, we know we're working with women-owned businesses or Black-owned businesses or veteran-owned businesses, but how do we know, you know, how do we get those numbers? And so we made an adjustment to our onboarding process where we actually gather that information now, you know, obviously through tender, but also working with brand new suppliers. So we had a way of kind of scooping up all the existing supply base just so we could survey them and understand, what sort of identity segment they fitted within. And now that's just part of something that we attend to, we report on, we actively, you know, seek organizations in those areas where there's a good fit for the solution. You know, obviously some solutions are very specific and technical to certain industries or certain supply types. So that's been hugely important, because without the data, it's a nice intention, but you can't, you know, you can't really make any assurances to those communities, and that's what they need. They need to know that it's not just good intention, you are serious about working with them.
And that is, you know, just as you said there in terms of the data, I mean, that's a massive data challenge, isn't it? And you think, know, my mind is literally blowing thinking about some of the transformation programs I've been on and some of the data challenges, just even when it comes to, you know, things like the finances and the HR. But just as you were literally talking there about suppliers and the data that you now need to hold to, especially if you are, oh my gosh, I've lost Rebecca again. I'm not having much fun. But the point that I'm making, which I'm sure Rebecca would agree with, in terms of as a data challenge, if we're now looking at particularly organisations that have things like supplier diversity programs, right? So suppliers who are committed to, companies that are committed to having diverse supplier base, the challenge of having to maintain and manage the data around, you know, for example, the management and the ownership of those suppliers to make sure that you are actually hitting those targets around supplier diversity is huge, right? So that was the point that I was going to make. I'm hoping Rebecca can come on for the last couple of minutes, because I was going to get into some of the practical ways that both small and large companies can improve diversity and inclusion in procurement, but the technology is not with us today. But I guess the one thing that I would talk about, actually, just leading on from what Rebecca was saying, I think there is definitely something about the technology and systems enabling that. So if you have got that challenge around data and the integrity of data around, you know, your suppliers, and you know, it's always horrible putting labels on, you know, people and companies and things like that, because labels are for cancer food, as we know. But if you are, you know, if you are serious about supply diversity and fairness of opportunity, which obviously is what a lot of this is about, there is something about the integrity of the data and how do you collect that data. So, you know, working with IT partners, etc., to make sure that that happens. First of all, in terms of setting a benchmark, a baseline. So where are you currently? Where are you at the moment? And where is it that you're trying to get to? Rebecca, I was just waxing lyrical there about the importance of the data in terms of both setting your targets but also knowing what your baseline is, so knowing where you are now in terms of, particularly if you are, you know, committed to, for example, supply diversity, you know, having those having the clear baseline for the data and then setting targets. But I guess I'd probably you know, the final bit that I really wanted to get from you before you go is, you know, what can small and large companies do to improve diversity and inclusion in procurement, you know, whether that be internally within the teams or with their suppliers. I loved what you said, actually, before we get to that final question. I loved what you said about the ERGs connecting, so the employer resource groups connecting between different companies. I love that concept, because ERGs can sometimes be a lonely and, you know, very tiring place to be in terms of trying to make change internally. So connecting with others and seeing what works, I think, is fantastic.
You're absolutely right. And I think that sense of connection and collaboration is really, really key for all those organizations thinking about diverse talent. You've got to reach people where they are. And I
Yeah,
think that means for those organizations being visible in spaces where diverse talent can see you is super important, and
yeah,
whether that's the fact that they're visible online in certain groups, or
yeah,
potentially attending events, or demonstrating that they're allies or advocates for diverse talent. All of those things just send the right message to
yeah,
those marginalized communities to know, that you're welcome, the door is
yeah,
open, please do
absolutely.
consider us.
Yeah,
Diverse talent is huge. There's so much
yeah,
incredible talent out there, and obviously the many organizations will be actively seeking those communities to understand how they can build a pipeline. And so I think it's ensuring that there's just a really compelling employee proposition for those
yeah,
people, so that they understand, okay, I've got options for different organizations. There may be a large multinational that's got really well established, as you say, employee resource groups,
yeah,
and potentially, like Coventry Building Society, has an ethnicity career development program where
yeah,
I will specifically sort of have a kind of resource directed to me. But
yeah,
small businesses and other types of organizations also
yeah,
offer great opportunities, perhaps more opportunity for on the job learning,
yeah,
more opportunity to connect directly with mentors who are in very senior roles, because they have quite a flat structure, and
yeah,
more opportunities to work on a range of different projects, which actually
yeah,
might give you the chance to accelerate your career faster
yeah,
than if you were working in a very, very structured environment where you only move roles,
yeah,
every so many years. So I think it's just important for those organizations to really know, what their USP is,
yeah,
and to make that front and center so visible, just like, as when we're working with Collider, so many wonderful diverse suppliers out there, and we always encourage those organizations, say what is so special about working with you, the fact
yeah,
that you do have really niche experience, the fact that your talent is, has incredible deep knowledge and
yeah,
expertise, and maybe you can be accessible to us in a way that a large, multinational team can't be,
yeah,
because they have their own sort of organizational restraints. Actually, the freedom, the latitude, the agility that
yeah,
those smaller businesses have is of huge interest,
yeah,
both, for recruitment side and from the supplier side.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely fantastic. Okay, I'm going to let you go while we've got you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks for
But
bearing with me.
no,
Appreciate
no,
it.
thank you so much for your time, Rebecca. I know that you are incredibly busy and in demand. So thank you so much. I know that this was a really popular one, and hopefully it's gotten some people thinking about this as a
Absolutely.
topic, if they're in procurement and supply chain management. So thank you again, Rebecca. And thank you,
Thank you.
everybody, if you're watching live or tuning in later. Hope you have an amazing weekend.